Why does this card suck? Find out next on Commander Replay. Welcome back, everyone. So like many of you, I was excited when I saw the spoiler for Cartographers Hawk. You read it and you're like, wow, this is cool. This is a 2-mana creature that ramps in white. But after actually playing the card a little bit, I've determined that it's unplayable trash. And in this video, we're going to talk about why and what WotC could have done differently to make this card better and more playable. So my goal here isn't to shame anyone if they are running Cartographers Hawk. Instead, it's about talking about the design elements that went wrong on this card, and the frustration that causes when they tell us there's a new card in white that's going to ramp, and it turns out to actually not be playable at all. So the main problem with this card is that there are too many conditions on it. So reading the card, it's 1 and a white for a 2/1 with flying. When it deals combat damage to a player who controls more lands than you, return it to its owner's hand. If you do, you may search your library for a Plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So there are a bunch of conditions in here that cause this card to be super slow and take away any playability that it might have had. The first is, and this is a fairly standard clause for white cards, damage to a player who controls more lands than you. I get it, the more lands than you text is on a lot of different white cards that deal with lands, but the problem is, with those cards, you can never get ahead of your opponent. You can only catch up to the lead opponent, but never surpass them. I get that white shouldn't have like completely unrestricted ramp, but the ramp cards you do play should allow you to actually get ahead. So I'd like to see cards get away from this more lands than you clause, because you're still always waiting for someone else to ramp, and then this card does nothing if you are actually ahead in the game. So this card only does its thing when you're behind. As a side note, in addition to the large amount of treasures that Smothering Tithe can make, it's also the fact that it can actually put you ahead of your opponents in terms of mana production, which is something most other white ramp cards can't do. And this is why it's so good. And again, being able to catch up is important, but it's not the only thing. You also want to be able to take advantage while you're ahead, and this card does not do that. The second, and this is the one that really kills it, is you may return it to its owner's hand. If you do, search your library for a Plains. So that shuts off any ability to get multiple triggers out of this card. You can't put double strike on it, you can't use multiple combats, it's not an ETB, and it forces you to have to spend more mana to recast it. And then finally, the last condition is that the Plains does come into play tapped. What all of this means is you end up with a card that is super slow. It's a 3-turn cycle from the time you cast this thing until you actually get a usable land out of it. Which brings us to our next topic, time. Time is the resource you have the least of in a game of Commander, aka turns, and is the hardest to generate more of. Blue is the only color that generates extra turns effectively, meaning that if you aren't running blue or aren't running extra turn spells, it is very difficult to create more turns in a game. Every turn that passes in a game of Commander means that the game is more likely to end. It's only possible to answer so many different things, so at some point, someone will find their win condition, and no one else will have an answer for it. So as the turn count goes higher, the game is more likely to end. Which means you need cards that have immediate impact, and that's why ETB creatures are so popular and so powerful in Commander, because you need to get something out of your creatures right now. You can't wait 2 or 3 turns to get benefit out of them. And it's also why, in a generic mono black deck, you're much more likely to see Noxious Gearhulk than you are Visara the Dreadful, because Noxious Gearhulk destroys a creature immediately, Visara has to wait to untap. And unless you can give Visara haste or untap it multiple times, it's probably going to be the worst of the 2 choices for most decks. And that's where the problem with Cartographers Hawk comes in. This is a 3-turn cycle to get a single land into play tapped. And speaking of waiting to untap, if you need to untap with your creatures, they better be really powerful. Case in point, Atali. Atali is awesome when you untap with it. Now I get it, you can give it haste and that does make it better. But in general, just assuming that you cast Atali, have to wait for it to go around the table, when it comes back to your turn, Atali does awesome things. Cartographers Hawk putting a land into play tapped is not Atali. So let's run through a little simulation of the best possible scenario with Cartographers Hawk. So it's turn 2, you cast the Hawk, it comes into play, it can't attack yet. You pass, it comes to turn 3, you drop your land per turn, you swing with the Hawk, get into your opponent. Oh, and by the way, if you're on the play, someone has to have ramped already. You get the Plains into play tapped. The Hawk bounces to your hand, And finally, on turn 4, you have the land that you spent all this time and effort trying to get, and then of course you can make your 5th land drop. In this same time, you could have played any Signet-style mana rock to get this same effect, and it would have produced mana 1 turn sooner. So this makes the Hawk much worse than basically any mana rock that's available. And I left it out of this example, but you can recast the Hawk and try to do it again. But now it's eating up more mana, and that will make it really hard to be mana positive by playing the Hawk. Let's assume another scenario. Now it's turn 8 and you draw the Hawk. What is the likelihood that this game is actually going to get to turn 10 and you actually get to use that land? Some games will, but a large percentage of them won't. Even casual decks can end the game pretty easily by turn 9 quite often. Which means you have this card that is now once again no longer giving you a benefit. Which brings us to our next point, which is reliability. In the handful of times that I've actually seen Cartographer's Hawk, what actually happens to it is, someone casts it, and then a board wipe happens, and then it does nothing. So the problem is that it's not reliably giving you mana ramp, it is reliably a 2/1 flyer, and not much else. But if you compare that to something like Verge Rangers, a pretty cool card that's actually going to be much better for your mana production situation, because you may look at the top card of your library at any time. So even if you're not getting lands, you're still getting information all of the time, so you're still getting some value out of it. Whereas with the Hawk, most of the time, you probably actually aren't getting any benefit out of it, it's just a 2/1 with flying. Now let's compare that to, say, Fabro Elder. I'm gonna suggest that in a game where you tap Fabro Elder twice, you will produce way more mana than the Hawk ever will, and probably even on a single tap, for only a green and a white mana. Because in the games that I've seen with it, the Hawk gets 0 to 1 lands on average. So yeah, 2 taps of a Fabro Elder gonna give you way more mana than the Hawk ever will. And finally, let's compare it to a card like Wood Elves, which is very reliable mana ramp, shows up in a lot of green decks. Wood Elves is great because you cast it, you get a forest, no questions asked, and it comes in untapped. But what really makes Wood Elves good beyond that is the fact that it can be blinked, bounced, and reanimated, which means that you're probably getting more than one trigger off of the Wood Elves, and this is what makes it really, really good. Getting a single forest with it is fine, getting multiple forests is probably game winning, and it's unfortunate that the Hawk just can't do this because of the bounce text. So here's a list of cards that I think are going to be way better than Cartographer's Hawk. I'm going to start with Marble Diamond. Marble Diamond is an incredibly mediocre piece of mana ramp, but it's still going to be way better than the Hawk because you play it on one turn and then it's ready to go the next turn, which is still a full turn sooner than the land that you're trying to get out of the Hawk. Oh, and also, if the Hawk gets swept away in a board wipe, you got no lands out of it. So Marble Diamond, while it's incredibly mediocre, is still much more playable than the Hawk. And then of course we have Mind Stone, even Commander Sphere. I like both of these a lot better because they have synergy with Sun Titan, and you can draw extra cards if you need to. That brings me to a bunch more cards that I would absolutely play over the Hawk. Knight of the White Orchid is sort of like the good version of the Hawk. Only a single condition, and it brings the land into play untapped. Solemn Simulacrum, Core Cartographer, no conditions, you just put the land into play, and are really good in ETB type decks. And honestly, I'll take a card that just finds lands and puts them into my hand reliably, like Gift of Estates, Land Tax, or Tithe, because that's still going to be better than trying to mess around with the Hawk and waiting like 3 turns to get a single land into play. Here's some really mediocre options that, like, they go in some decks, they do not go in every deck. But I still think that they're better than the Hawk, and that's Walking Atlas, especially when paired with anything that will draw you cards, or Gift of Estates, Land Tax type stuff, and Boreas Charger and Oreskos. Again, not the best cards ever, but still more playable than the Hawk. And finally, a card that I've been jamming into a lot more decks recently is Oketra's Monument. Cost reduction's really powerful, and it doesn't matter what color creature you cast, you still get a 1/1 White Warrior with Vigilance out of it. So how could the Hawk have been better? What would have actually made it playable? Let's take a look. So I think the first thing they could have done, which would have been a really easy fix, is just add haste. That would reduce a full turn from the time it takes to get a benefit out of this card, and will put it kind of on par with something like a Marble Diamond other than the having to recast it. But I get it, haste is not a white ability, so that's probably not the route that they would have gone with it. So the next thing you can do is you can remove the text that says bounce it to your hand, and this would allow you to actually get multiple triggers either via Double Strike or extra combats, especially with Double Strike being a white ability. This is the thing that frustrates me to no end, is that white cards should be able to synergize with other white cards. The other 4 colors get to do this a lot. Black has graveyard stuff, blue has spellcaster stuff, green has mana ramp, and red has damage. White doesn't have a lot, but it does have things that give double strike, so if you could double strike the Hawk, that would be 2 lands, and that would be pretty sweet. And it still has the who controls more lands than you text, so you're never going to surpass your opponents in lands, you're only ever going to catch up to the lead opponent. So you're not exactly just running away with the game, even if you took a bunch of extra combats or put double strike on it. It's only ever going to make you even with the lead player if you change this text. Another way to do it would be to remove the condition that says to a player who controls more lands than you, but I don't think this one would be quite impactful enough, because it's still very slow, you're still having to mess around with recasting it, but it would still be cool that at least for all the hoops you've jumped through just to play it and attack with it successfully, that you would always get the land, even though it is still tapped. But again, I don't think that one's quite good enough, so let's take a look at something else. Another interesting way to actually speed this up to make it playable would be to remove the tapped text from the planes. If the planes came in untapped, that also removes an entire turn from the time it takes to get the benefit, so you're not caught in this 3-turn cycle any longer. You cast it on one turn, you attack the next turn, you get an untapped land that you can then use in your second main phase. And I think this change would be okay, I don't think it would make it overpowered or anything, I think it would be fine. But let's get crazy for a second and assume that you remove all the problematic text from Cartographer's Hawk. Now you've got a card that says, when it deals combat damage to a player, you may search your library for a plains, put it onto the battlefield untapped, and then shuffle your library. You can almost call this like Sword of the Animus .creature. There's some things that would make one better than the other in certain situations, and vice versa, but they'd probably be about similar to each other in terms of overall power. But as crazy as this is, it's still not running away with the game. It's still a creature that has to attack, has to successfully hit, and puts a single land onto the battlefield, which means this is still way worse than anything Oracle of Moldiah can do. Oracle of Moldiah is 2 lands a turn until you run out of lands either in your hand or on top of your library. No questions asked. Where even with this version of the Hawk, you're still jumping through a bunch of hoops, you have to cast it, you have to wait to untap with it, and if you put double strike on it, whoop-dee, you get 2 planes out of it. So I think this screen right here is a really good indication about how much they missed the mark by. You have to delete 3 separate conditions from this card just to make it reasonably playable, in my opinion. So with all that said, the only use cases for this card that I've actually found are Bird Tribal and God Eternal Oketra, because being able to recast the creature does give you some value. In both of these cases, the card is fine, but not amazing. So anyway, yeah, I'm gonna wrap up here. I'm super disappointed in the actual playability of Cartographer's Hawk. I don't know why they played it so safe. There's a million broken cards running around. This card came out in a Commander product. It's not even in Standard. There was just no reason to put this many conditions on a card and play it this safe. Especially compared to like last year's Commander product, which had Dockside Extortionist, which is like pay 2 mana, get anywhere from 3 to 10 treasure tokens immediately, and try to blink and reanimate it as much as humanly possible. So yeah, I'm super frustrated about the Hawk, and I think a lot of it has to do with the marketing and the hype around it. Hey, we made this white card that's gonna ramp, oh wait, it's actually terrible, because you need to wait 3 turns to get a single land. So I think the main lesson for the design team here is the understanding that benefits of a card need to be immediate, or if you need to untap with that card needs to be really good when it untaps. And unfortunately, Cartographer's Hawk is not that card. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. As always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching. The 2020 GoFundMe is active. If you want to do one-on-one deck reviews with me, or get one of your decks played on video, be sure to check out the link in the description below. I want to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. We have one new Patreon supporter in Valerie Hendricks. Valerie, you are awesome. If you want to help support the channel and vote on which decks I play next, feel free to check out my Patreon at the link below.